Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate for the eco-socialist Green New Deal and the eco-socialist program that Angela Walker, my running mate, and I ran on in 2020. So I had said in last week's podcast that we might have the Green Vice Presidential candidate Butch Ware on today. And now we're going to do it on September 7th. So he's coming, but not today. And next week, I'll be at the Socialism 2024 conference in Chicago. And I hope to get someone good on as a guest. But today, it's just me. So let's get to the news and events of the last week. There's a lot to comment on. And the Democratic National Convention, dominated the news. And, I think it was a well-staged messaging program, except for having Biden on Monday and Waltz on Tuesday, speaking well after 11 p.m. Eastern time. I mean, that was an amateur mistake. And they, let people like Bill Clinton drone on and on. So the people they wanted to feature got on after a lot of people on the East Coast anyway had gone to sleep. But I think the messaging was effective because politics is 90% emotional. People ask, how do I feel about the candidates? Who do I trust? Who cares about people like me? And only 10% are voters' preferences on the policy issues. So I think in that respect, it was effective. Nevertheless, behind all the unity and joy expressed from the convention stage and on the floor was the genocide in the room. It's a lot like 1968, like Hubert Humphrey was tied to Johnson's war in Vietnam in 1968. Kamala Harris is tied to Biden's war in Gaza in 2024. And while Harris, when she did speak, affirmed support for Palestinian self-determination in her speech, she did not express support or even hint at an arms embargo on Israel if it doesn't stop the war in Gaza. And I think Harris risks losing the election due to the alienation of tens of thousands of Palestinians and their allies in states like Michigan and Wisconsin. And Mehdi Hassan had a good op-ed on earlier in the week, and he said it was a no-brainer for Harris to break with Biden and condition arms to Israel on stopping the war in Gaza. And that's an op-ed worth reading. We'll put it in the chat. The polling shows that the majority of Americans and a majority of Democrats would support conditioning arms to Israel on stopping that war. And it shows that Harris wouldn't lose votes, but she'd probably gain a lot. But the Democratic leadership ducked this question in the convention. In fact, they refused to have any Palestinian voice on the main stage. And we'll put this in the chat too. They were asking for Georgia State Representative Ruah Rahman, who she wasn't even a delegate, but she participated with the uncommitted caucus, who sent to the DNC leadership and the Harris campaign. They sent the speech for vetting and asked that she be given, it's just a 2-minute speech. And, you can read it when you get a chance. It should go in the chat. And I think that was an unforced error. It's just shameful that they had no Palestinian speaker. The whole convention, 16 hours of primetime programming. And, it's a slap in the face. And ignoring that issue, which was in the room but not talked about, could cost the Democrats the election. One indication is there was a group forming Muslim Women for Harris. After the Ruah Rahman's speech was denied, they withdrew their endorsement from Harris. And, they're going to be campaigning for no votes or maybe a protest vote for Jill Stein. And if the Democrats lose Michigan and that costs them the election, of course, they're going to blame Jill Stein, but they'll only have themselves to blame. But overall, I think in terms of the masses of people watching it, the Democrats hit the right tone. They affirmed the democratic and progressive traditions of America that most people hold, as opposed to Trump, who's constantly running down others and denigrating the country. And I think a lot of people will find that appealing. They conveyed how those values are embodied by Kamala Harris and Tim Walz with personal stories. And personal stories are very effective. They always move us and stick with us better than wonky statistics and policy details. I think the Democrats were also effective, and this is what Trump needs, ridiculing. They ridiculed his mean-spirited divisiveness and preposterous lies. And, that bumbling campaign, it's still astonishing that he has so much support. But in fact, he does. It's going to be a close election, although I think Harris has the upper hand at this point. They just did a great job of portraying Trump as mean-spirited, whiny, selfish, petty, weak, and just plain weird, as Tim Walz called him. And I think that stuck on Trump. And the contrast on the values was accompanied by a second theme, which wasn't as highlighted, but it was emphasized by a lot of speakers, and that's a progressive economic populism. In fact, there was more pro-union, anti-corporate themes and speeches from the main stage, I think, since the New Deal era of the 1930s to 60s from the Democratic Party. Their neoliberal turn in the 1970s, from that point until this, you wouldn't have heard speeches like we heard in this convention, going after the corporations and supporting the unions. But on the other hand, while the progressive populist rhetoric was there, it was pretty thin on policy. And what policy was offered is pretty meek and mild compared to what's needed to really take on corporate power and the economic hardships people are facing. So, let me run down some of the speeches. I think there were some really good ones. I want to point them out. On Monday night, it wasn't the headliners like Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden that I think, really were most effective. It was, the supporting cast. I think Steve Kerr, the Warriors basketball coach, fresh back from a victory for the U.S. Olympic team in basketball, he had a great talk about how you need unifying leadership for a team versus Trump's divisive misleadership. And he concluded by telling Donald Trump, as he said in the words of the great Stephen Curry, night, night. And he used Curry's gesture, he uses after he sinks that game-winning three-pointer to say to the other team, it's over. I thought that was very effective. And then Jasmine Crockett, the representative in the House from Texas, told an anecdote about how Kamala Harris saw the anguish she had when she was, just getting into Congress, and she went over for a photo with Kamala Harris at the vice president's residency. And Harris saw, the anguish right away and talked to her and encouraged her. And I thought, and Jasmine Crockett teared up at that. It seemed very, spontaneous and sincere. I think that was just powerful testimony for the kind of person Kamala Harris is. So that was Monday night. Tuesday night, it was the headliners who I thought were very effective. Doug Emhoff, who's Kamala Harris's husband, just humanized and validated Kamala Harris in a very intimate way with personal stories. And then Michelle Obama gave the best speech at the convention. And this time she wasn't doing like she used to do. We go low and when they go low, we go high. She just made a devastating critique of Trumpism without ever actually mentioning Trump's name. It was a great speech. And then Barack Obama, as he said, I'm stupid to be following Michelle Obama. And he was right. Her speech overshadows his, although I think his was very effective in the same way. Then came Wednesday. And Oprah, I thought, people that follow Oprah, that's a powerful endorsement. And then Tim Walz gave his speech. And, he really came across as down to earth, someone most Americans could relate to as a public school teacher, a football coach, a neighbor. He's a very effective communicator. He's not slick like the Obamas, but he makes his points very clear. And unfortunately, Bill Clinton droned on like he did in 1988 when he was the keynote speaker. And at the end of that speech, when he said, in conclusion, that's when the cheers came from the people at the convention. He just went on and on. He's just full of himself, and he took twice the allotted time he was given. That's just disrespectful. And Waltz, by contrast, gave a tight 15-minute speech that left the viewers understanding what he's about and what he stands for. So then Thursday, it was, a lot of lead up to Harris, but, she was featured and they didn't have real powerful speakers before her. So she really stood out and she made her case against Trump like the prosecutor she is. And she did it like a court case. She introduced herself as she used to do in court as a prosecutor as Kamala Harris for the people. And then in her opening statement, she told personal stories about her life that ordinary people can relate to. Then she made her case, and it was much more forceful and concrete than people like Biden and other Democratic leaders have made against Trump. It was a prosecution. And then she made her case for what she would do as president. And, it wasn't very thick or detailed on policy. I think she's kind of running an Obama hope and change campaign. It's in the center and not putting out too much concrete policy that can be criticized, but hoping the theme will, get voters' support. And her tone and demeanor, in contrast to, the smiling, joyous stump speeches and rallies we've seen, was serious. And, she looked and sounded presidential. So I think that hit home with viewers. And then she made her closing statement or argument like a prosecutor, summarizing the evidence and calling on American people like she would call on a jury to render a righteous verdict in the election. So I think that speech was a home run. But again, the giant elephant in the room remained the war in Gaza. AOC, Bernie Sanders, Keith Ellison, and a few others had called for a ceasefire. Even Joe Biden did again, and even said the protesters had a point about civilian deaths. But again, no talk about any conditioning aid, military aid to Israel on stopping the war, no Palestinian speakers. When Harris spoke, when she said, with respect to Gaza or something like that, you could hear a pin drop because everybody wanted to hear what she had to say on that. And she basically repeated the Biden line, that we've got to defend Israel. What Hamas did was horrific. And I wouldn't argue with those points. But then when it came to the war, she did say, we need to recognize what's happening to the Palestinians and, provide peace and equality and self-determination, which means the two-state solution. But that was just one line. And, she may lose the election if she doesn't give many Palestinian, Arab, Muslim, and any genocide voters in the swing states reason to vote for her. And I don't think what she said in her speech did that. And then outside the arena, unfortunately, the street protests that were meant to influence the Democrats outside the division, outside the convention, really didn't give people inside the convention much reason to move away, or the Harris campaign to move away from Biden on Gaza. I mean, these protests were tiny, nothing like 1968. That year, Vietnam was a central issue. Unfortunately, the Gaza slaughter with U.S. bombs is not. So on Sunday, there was a demonstration called by Bodies Outside Unjust Laws, a coalition, had 1,000, maybe 2,000 people. That demonstration, unwieldy name for the coalition, but good politics. It was led by abortion rights groups and LGBTQ groups, not the sectarian groups of the authoritarian left, which organized some of the other demos. PSL, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, kind of hijacked the march dynamic. I've heard from people who were there with their ubiquitous posters, and they had their people leading chants, not the people of the march, or they drowned out the people of the march. PSL's presidential candidate, Claudia de la Cruz, did get to speak at the concluding rally on the condition that she didn't say she was running for president. That was kind of weird. Jill Stein, as far as I know, was not present at that one. So that was on Sunday before the convention. On Monday was supposed to be the big march by the coalition to march on the DNC, but unfortunately it was led by a sectarian group of the authoritarian left, the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. And they were working mainly in the Palestinian networks with the U.S. Palestinian Community Network. But they had a few thousand, according to both the New York Times and Common Dreams. Police estimated 3,500. Organizers claim 15,000, but that's just not credible looking at the pictures of the march and the videos of the march. And the Palestinian Community Network said they would draw on tens of thousands of the 85,000 Palestinians and 120,000 Arabs in the Chicago area. But they failed at that. The mosques and the Greek Orthodox churches to which those Arab communities belong did not mobilize their members. The organizers added Cornel West to speak from the podium at the last minute. He was not a scheduled speaker. Jill Stein was there, but they didn't let her speak. I don't know all the background on that. But anyway, the rally was held at Union Park, which is half a mile from the convention site at the United Center. And the rallies on Wednesday and Thursday would do the same thing. So they'd kick off from Union Park, go over to Humboldt Park, and then come back to the, no, I'm sorry, not Humboldt Park, Park 578. So they made a loop. They were about, couple, 3 blocks away from the convention. They could be heard by people coming out of the convention, but it just wasn't that big. It wasn't the kind of thing that happened in 1968. Also on Monday, the Poor People's Army, who's led by Sherry Honkala, a Green that ran for vice president with Jill Stein in 2012, they were camped out at Humboldt Park, 3 miles from the United Center. And Jill Stein was there for a pre-march press conference and walked all the way with the 100 or so marchers. It wasn't a big march. And Sherry got arrested when the march was stopped after 2.5 miles on their way to the convention center because the street they came across was closed for the motorcades for Biden and Harris. I don't know what happened to Sherry. I don't know what the charges were. I just know she was arrested. So then Tuesday, there was a group called Behind Enemy Lines, and they were, really looking for confrontation. And they got it. They went to the Israeli consulate. 56 got arrested. Doesn't appear that many more people than that participated. So I don't think they had much impact on the convention. And then Wednesday, the Palestinian community had their own march. Same format, rally at Union Park, marched to near the United Center. About 2,000 participated. Jill Stein as well as Cornel West got to speak at that one. And then Thursday was the second march by the coalition, the march on the DNC. And this one was slightly larger than Monday. It had about 4,000 at its peak. It had more Palestinians from the Chicago area. It's probably because, except for that Tuesday night thing by Behind Enemy Lines, the marches had been peaceful and they were trying to be family oriented. In fact, the police complimented the marshals on these marches for helping them keep order and isolate people looking to instigate a confrontation. So, and in fact, on Thursday night, delegates leaving the convention could hear the demonstration just a little more than a block away, and a few joined it. There were some other events that Jill Stein attended. There was a abandoned Harris press conference. Cornel West, Claudia De La Cruz. It was broadcast online. It didn't look to me like there was more than the dozen or so people on the podium. It just didn't seem. It wasn't a big event. And then another event, Workers Strike Back, claimed there were 200 in a room, and Jill spoke. That was organized by Shama Sawant's Workers Strike Back, which recently split from Socialist Alternative, for those of you keeping score on what the sectarian left is up to. So, they were online. They claimed about 1,000 were watching, but I don't think it had much impact on the convention, and it certainly wasn't recognized by the mass media. And aside from Jill and her immediate staff, I really didn't see any visible Green presence in these actions. The National Green Party endorsed the Bodies Outside Unjust Laws on Sunday and the Poor People's Army on Monday, but don't seem to have mobilized many people. I'm sure there were some Chicago area Greens there, but there was no visibility I could see from the video. So, to evaluate how these protests went, they were far too small to shake the Democrats from their position on unconditional support for Israel's apartheid occupation and genocide toward the Palestinians. And I think these tiny demonstrations reflect the state of the left in the US. The best funded and organized groups are these small Leninist cadre organizations whose members pay a significant portion of their income as dues and spend a significant portion of their time to party activities, and thus have the money and staffing to pull off the logistics of these things. But their top-down organizing style and their political positions, their support for authoritarian so-called anti-imperialist states, means they have limited appeal to the broad base of progressive-minded people, including large Palestinian population in Chicago. And, reports I've been getting from people who attended is they were overwhelmingly white, not that many Palestinians and Arabs, somewhat different from the other national pro-Palestinian marches we've seen on the East Coast. And you can see it in the videos for yourself. That's really what was there. Now, the Greens, we do have a much broader base and appeal, but we don't have the organized base of dues-paying members, so the party has the resources that could support our participation in action like these, and better to lead organizing such actions. That's a way, we can broaden our base of support, where people see the Greens are movers and shakers, not just people who show up, which we do. We are pretty good at showing up. And if we're going to use this election to influence national policy, particularly on the burning issue of genocide in Gaza, we can still do it. We can bring it into congressional campaigns through press conferences, actions at candidate debates, demonstrations outside candidate headquarters, leafleting. There's a whole range of things we can be doing. And the more we do that, I think the more influence we'll have. Because right now, these national demonstrations just haven't, put made the Democrats fear it's going to have a consequence for them. Although their pollsters know they better be careful in states like Michigan and Wisconsin, where it could, where the Palestinian and Arab community vote could be the margin of difference. And by doing these actions now, even if we don't have our own candidates, which would give us a stronger platform, we can lay the political premises for future House elections, which I've argued here and I'm going to keep arguing is that's how we're going to influence national policy. Presidential campaigns, with the billions of dollars required and the difficulties in ballot access at this point, and the way the corporate media cover it, we just really don't have an impact in setting the policy debate agenda. But we can in congressional districts, and if we do that at the grassroots across the country, I think we can have national influence. I think that's what's going to take. Now, another elephant in the room at the Democratic National Convention were corporations, elephants in the room, a stampede of elephants. I mean, for all the progressive populist economic rhetoric we got from Bernie Sanders and AOC and United Auto Workers President Sean Fain and a number of other speakers, for all that pro-union rhetoric, behind the scenes, giant corporations were paying millions of dollars for access and influence with all the state delegations. So, the Democratic Party remains a party completely committed to and funded by big business in the capitalist system. Now, another thing going on is the progressives also have their own events outside the main stage. And I think Greens should take note. The DNC, the Democratic National Convention, used this as an occasion for hundreds of workshops on various issues and how to organize, many of them hosted by progressive organizations. One old lefty, Carl Davidson, who was back in the late mid 60s in the SDS leadership and has been active ever since, called the Democratic National Convention a cadre organizing school. They got people organized for the Democrats' ground game. And look, there were a lot of people there. That 25,000 seat arena at United Center was packed full every night. And with meeting and exhibit rooms around the United Center, they can host 40,000 people, uh, along with and 15,000 more people, but in that center alone. And then there were a lot of events at nearby venues like McCormick Place Convention Center. That's 5 miles away, but they had a whole program there. I mean, I've seen estimates of 50,000 people in attendance for the various events associated with this convention. So the Democrats are coming out of this with a lot of people fired up and ready to implement their ground game. And then the weekend before, we had the Green Convention. And by contrast, we were online. And, maybe a couple hundred people participated, in the workshops and as delegates at the formal decision making on Saturday. So we had a small number of online workshops. I presented in two, one on electoral reform for an inclusive multi-party democracy, and the other with Chris Blankenhorn, who usually does the background production for these podcasts, called Eco-Socialist Organizing for a Green Future. And Chris did another one called Grassroots Local Organizing, which I hosted behind the scenes and screwed up. I'm not technically proficient, but it was good enough. It happened. But these workshops reached tens of people. The biggest one I was in on electoral reform had 50, while the Democrats had tens of thousands in their own workshops and then millions watching online or on the TV. And what we missed, which the Democrats had, was that in-person relationship building outside formal events or inside them as well in workshops and whatnot, that strengthens, our sense of common purpose and people we know that we can work with. So after the workshops on Thursday and Friday, that night, Friday night, Jill live streamed a program introducing her choice for vice president. It's Butch Ware, who I said before will be on this podcast in 2 weeks on September 7th. But I think, one thing I take away is there's no substitution for an in-person convention. It's better democracy. It's really hard online to have a deliberative process that makes decisions. I mean, we sort of had formalities to go through, so it wasn't a problem in getting the decisions made. But if we'd had issues we needed to talk through and find out where people really stood, we just would have really had trouble online. And of course, the other thing I mentioned is the relationships we build. Now, cost is an issue, everybody getting to the same place, but that's surmountable. And COVID is also an issue, but masking can still be done to reduce the dangers. Socialism 2024 in Chicago over Labor Day weekend, where a few thousand will gather, is requiring masks. I think that's a good idea. I hope a lot of people, they didn't have COVID running around that convention, or, a lot of people could be sick. And that's still serious, as I'm going to talk about in a minute. And I also want to say that I think the tone of the Stein campaigns, Jill's speeches and the email blasts, they're just too heavy on the negative side of things. I think it overstates the problems of Harris and the Democrats and asks for support on a negative basis of what's wrong with the Democrats. And that's not going to resonate well with progressive-minded people who are rightly afraid of Trump and to whom Harris looks better now than Biden did, particularly after the way they presented themselves at this convention. And I've run a lot of campaigns, and I know, because I've done a lot of door knocking, talked to a lot of people. People want to hear what you will do, not so much what's wrong with the other guy. They think I can figure that out for myself. I want to know what you're going to do. Who are you? So I think the message should be more positive about how your vote for the green ticket will help move the country toward policies that we want on economic justice, climate action, fair elections, and ending the genocide in Gaza. Positive contrast with Harris and Trump will work better than negative criticisms, particularly those which sometimes come from the Stein campaign that imply Harris and Trump are equally bad. And, whether it's abortion or the border or other things, there's obviously major differences. And so that message just really seems divorced from reality. To potential Green voters, those people who are progressives who, they're not happy with Harris and the Democrats, but they're afraid of Trump. Should they vote for the Greens to, express what they really want. And if we're all negative, I don't think we're going to be so inviting for them. Now, admittedly, the Stein campaign is now in a much more difficult political dynamic now that Harris has replaced Biden. But a bitter negative message is not going to win over people as well as a hopeful positive message. Who wants to join a movement that sounds bitter and complaining about the barriers it faces? It doesn't sound like any fun. People will join and want to join movements that sound confident of making gains and find joy in the work. And I think the Democrats did a good job in their convention of making their cause look friendly and fun. And as much as we disagree with the Democrats on policy, I think the Greens can learn from the Democrats on how, their messaging was inviting to the people who are watching. And I'm not advocating a light on policy, high on vibes approach. We're very critical of that. We want, as Mondale once said to, who was it, Dan Quayle, where's the beef? For you older people, that was a takeoff from a hamburger commercial. But anyway, where's the beef? A lot of people still do want to know that. And I'm seeing that across the Democratic board. Here in New York, we had 4 traditionally Democratic districts go to the Republicans in 2022, which gave the House to the Republican majority in that year. And I'm looking like my candidate in my district, the Democratic candidate, still doesn't have a policies or issues page on his website. He's been campaigning for a year. He's just trying to run on, that Republican is crazy, which he is. But, that doesn't give people a positive reason to vote for him. And in my experience in this district, the only time Democrats have won the district is when Greens ran, because we put issues on the table, made the Democrats respond, and they ended up sounding better than they did in other races where they, tacked to the right and just tried to portray the Republican as crazy. And their base didn't come out for them. And I'm afraid that's going to happen again. And in fact, there was a story yesterday that all the Democrats running in these districts that the Republicans took from them, they're not running on issues. They don't have issues on their web pages. So I'm not saying we should be all vibes and no policy, especially because we're Greens. We have issues. The corporate sponsored parties don't have real solutions. And in my experience in campaigns, they don't know how to deal with issues because they're not used to it. They don't really know how to, present their issues and argue for them. And we can beat them in debates. So I'm just saying we have to raise our issues in a hopeful, positive way if we're going to reach masses of people and win elections. So, the next thing that happened on Friday was Robert F. Kennedy Jr. exited and endorsed Trump. And this guy, if weird applies to anybody, it's this guy. Polling indicates that, most current RFK supporters will go to Trump. My first thought was these are double haters, so they might vote for Jill Stein. But I think the polls have shown as Kennedy support has declined from the mid-teens earlier this year to the low single digits in recent weeks. And most of that peeling away came from progressive voters who, have been attracted by the liberal aura of the Kennedy name until they found out his reactionary positions on Gaza, Ukraine, immigration, vaccines, baseless conspiracy theories, as well as his bizarre confessions about the dead worm in his brain and the dropping a dead bear cub in Central Park as a supposed joke, and his release of videos of himself bench pressing and shirtlessly in Venice Beach, California, admitting that he's sexually assaulted and apologizing for assaulting a babysitter. I mean, that means, I guess, the people left with Kennedy are, the more conservative, people that he's become not that much different from Trump. So I'm afraid most of that's, Kennedy support is going to go to Trump. And we're going to put in the chat an article by Greg Palast, who's an investigative reporter who's been covering voter suppression for years and other scandals, good anti-corporate reporter. We've had him on this podcast. He just wrote an article about how Kennedy went crazy. He called it, I was on the phone with RFK Jr. when he lost his mind. So we'll put that in the chat. There it is. Um, and, it's actually kind of a sad story because Palast had co-authored books and articles with Kennedy, over a dozen years ago about voter suppression and election rigging. But Kennedy's just lost his mind. Now, the Green Party in New York and several Greens in New York, myself included, are parties to a lawsuit Kennedy has brought against New York's terrible ballot access laws. In fact, we have the hardest petitioning requirements in the country now. And last night I talked to a Kennedy lawyer about the lawsuit, and he said he was confident Kennedy would continue to provide funding for the lawyers to pursue our case. I hope so, but we'll see. Who the hell knows what Kennedy's going to do? So that's a new wrinkle in the campaign. And let me just wrap up. I've been going on for about half an hour, but I want to remember two people. One is Alice Green, and we'll put a Twitter thread I did commemorating her. She was a Green Party member and a great warrior for racial justice. She was the Green candidate for lieutenant governor in New York in 1998 when we first won a ballot line, and she was also the Green candidate for mayor of Albany in 2005 and received 25% of the vote. She was well known in Albany. She was Albany's foremost champion for racial justice, police and prison reform, against the death penalty. She formed a group called Center for Law and Justice in 1985, which was her base for those campaigns, and also provided legal support for poor people facing the criminal justice system. And it seemed like everybody in Albany knew her when we were petitioning to put her on the ballot in 2005 for mayor. Many people thought we'd named the Green Party after her last name. And Alice died suddenly on Tuesday from cardiac arrest after being sick with COVID in recent days. And Alice ran marathons. She was in great health. It was not her heart that failed her. It was COVID that attacked her heart. So I hope people are still taking precautions against COVID. It's spiking again. And that's another beef I've got with the major parties and people like Robert Kennedy who act as if it's still not an issue, still not out there. So Alice is irreplaceable, but she will remain an inspiration for many of us who knew her. So check out the Twitter thread. And then there was another death, and this is somebody not well known, but he was a young man, 25 years old, named Matthew Freeman, who was shot dead last Saturday night by a 13-year-old, just a few blocks from where I'm sitting right now. And Matthew and his family lived downstairs from me for a few years, about 15 years ago when he was in elementary school. And he was a friendly kid. He liked to introduce me to his friends as his friend, the Green politician. He got a kick out of that. Unfortunately, Matthew got caught up in the street gang scene here in Syracuse, where we have been among the top 3 cities in the country for years in shootings by teenagers. In fact, he served 3 years for illegal gun possession from 2019 to 2022, but his family says he was, doing pretty good since he got out a couple years ago. And in this case, he was not the target. He wasn't involved in the beef. He was an innocent bystander. And that just hits home for me because we need to end poverty and the lack of opportunities that plague disadvantaged Black communities like here in the south side of Syracuse. Street gangs provide the bonds of friendship and community that the society is not providing, particularly in families that are traumatized and disrupted by poverty and mass incarceration. And it also brings home the need to pass and enforce stronger gun safety laws to keep guns out of the hands of children, as well as criminal street gangs. So many people around here are packing, and it leads to a never-ending cycle of retribution. People are packing pistols because they're afraid and they want to defend themselves. And, we're getting nothing from the federal government to deal with communities like this, to end all this sorrow and travesty. So The major parties aren't doing it. That's why we need the Green Party. So I went on a long time today, but I'm looking forward to your comments and questions. Violet at Content Boutique. Howie, any thoughts on Butch? Just getting to know him. Yeah, I do, and I will, say most of that for when he comes on the program in a couple weeks. I will say, and I told him this, that I thought his acceptance speech at the convention, and they only gave him 5 minutes. I mean, why don't they give more time to our candidates? Jill as well. But I really appreciated the way he connected our battles for freedom and justice to the best traditions of America. And I think that's, as I was talking about earlier, a better way to present what we're doing than, feeling bitter and victimized and kind of sounds powerless. So I thought he was really good that way. And so, let's save. I'm not going to comment on too much because I'm getting to know him too. Let's get to know him better in 2 weeks. For that podcast where I will not give a long rant like I did today beforehand. We'll go right to Butch and have him speak and answer our questions. Beloved community, looks like Jill Stein will be on fewer ballots in 2016. Surprising write-in status in some states. Sad. Yeah, I kind of looked at the map pretty closely, and I think 33 to 35 is about where it's going to be. And the campaign, they will do an evaluation of, what they did well, what they didn't in terms of getting ballot access. It's a monster task. I did listen to Robert Kennedy's speech yesterday, and wow, he infuriated me most of the time. What he said about the difficulty of ballot access, I could relate to. It's just, this country is just off the chart compared to other countries, just getting into elections. Countries that are, multi-party democracies. I think the amount of ballots we have reflects really the status of the grassroots base of the Green Party. It's not as strong as it was in 2016. We got stronger from 2012 to 2016 because Jill, in 2012, she got 469,000 votes, I think, as opposed to our previous two candidates in 2004 and 2008 who got, barely 100,000 votes. So I think that encouraged people. And between 2012 and 2016, we're in the second term of the Obama administration where a lot of progressives were really getting pissed off. So we had, energy coming to us. In 2016, Trump appeared on the scene to push people toward the Democrats in defensive votes. And Bernie Sanders showed up pulling a lot of progressives into the Democratic Party, hoping they could get what they were seeking through the Democratic Party, which, was never going to happen. But that's the situation we've had since 2016. We got on 30 ballots in 2020, and we had, COVID, which made it really hard to petition. But, as we campaigned, we found out which states actually have parties that can do stuff, got real people and volunteers on the ground, and which don't. But it was also, it was hard to petition that year. You approach somebody on the street in the middle of this pandemic, and you may be masked up carrying, the hand sanitizer, giving them a fresh pen that hasn't been touched. And they still, they walk the other way. They don't want to get near you because everybody was afraid of COVID. So it was a tough year. So I thought Jill would get on over 40 states. They were aiming for 50, as they should have. But as I looked at it, I thought 40 was doable. And now it looks like it's going to come up, maybe 35, even 33, somewhere in there. So I think, we use that as a measure of, our base. The campaign is always happened. The presidential campaign raises most of the funds to pay petitioners we can pay to go out and get ballot status. And what we really need are strong Green parties that can do it on the ground. In 1996, we've been building the Green Party since '84 by organizing locals and running local candidates. So by the time we convinced Ralph Nader to let us use his name, he wasn't going to campaign, raise over $5,000. He was going to stand, as he said, for president. And we had enough of a base that we could do 23 states on our own. And so in 2000, we got up to 44 states with Ralph. And while his campaign provided paid petitioners and raised a lot more money, our base was crucial to getting on a lot of those states. So I don't want people to blame the Stein campaign, although, constructive criticism should go forth on, where it might have made mistakes, particularly in, different states and different situations. But, it's really, I think, a measure of the base of the Green Party, which we've got to build. And as I've been arguing, I think we got to build it from below. Go back to local elections, build local chapters, and on that basis, move up to the state legislature and the House of Representatives. That's how we're going to become a really influential party nationally. Zimani, what we're seeing this year is a different strategy from Dems about the Greens. Duopoly's been more assertive in driving Greens off ballots. And in my opinion, that's why ballot access is lower, still strong. I don't know. They went after us. They knocked us off 3 states. They went after us in Texas. They failed there. And the apparatus of election boards or commissions and the courts, it was these people are all hacks. They vote their party, not what the law and the evidence in the petitions shows. And I think they'd have gone after us in other states if they had any hope. So I think at this point, Jill's been challenged in 5 states. We were challenged in 4. I'm not sure the Democrats' party's strategy has changed at all. I think it's been the same. It's that same guy, Mark Elias, who has a big law firm close to the Democrats, who is their election lawyer. He's the guy that beat Trump on, over 60 cases where Trump brought forward these, ridiculous lawsuits to try to get the vote changed after 2020. Good for him. But then when elections come, he turns on the Green Party. And he goes back to Nader's campaign, who wasn't a Green, he was running independent in 2004. Their strategy was to exhaust Nader and drain his resources by putting forward frivolous lawsuits against his petition or ballot, challenges in the process each state has, just to drain the resources. They openly admitted that. There was a member of Congress who by that time was a corporate lawyer whose name I'm forgetting. But he told, in a mainstream media interview, that was the goal. So I don't think it's changed. I think, the Democrats are going wherever they think they might have a chance, or at least have a chance of preoccupying the Greens with defense, like in Nevada. They challenged, we won in the election commission or election board process, and now they're challenging in court. And they really don't have a case. Nevada Greens got plenty of signatures. But they put in a complaint. The court has a hearing. You got to get a lawyer, pay them, have them, develop a brief. It takes time and money. And so I think my sense is the Democrats haven't changed, and they're going to try to smash us down any way they can, every opportunity they have. Zimani, Dems in their infinite generosity have decided to grace us with some nice New Deal noises and vibes. But in my opinion, voters will need to apply more pressure, far more pressure, to squeeze anything more tangible from them. Yeah, absolutely. And the pressure of running our own candidate in the presidential race and in other races is, the best pressure we've got. And I've said this many times, but when I got 5% against Andrew Cuomo, he moved because he realized he had to compete for the votes we got. And so we got a ban on fracking, a $15 minimum wage, paid family leave, an increase in funding for the schools. A lot of public school teachers. We got endorsements from union locals in defiance, 6 union locals, in defiance of the state teachers federation, who didn't want them to endorse us. They didn't endorse Cuomo either. The state federation. Everybody was mad with Cuomo, and Cuomo got the message because we got 5% of the votes. So we can have influence, but we got to, have candidates and then the street politics. I wish Greens would think of themselves as the people that are in the leadership of a lot of these actions rather than the people who show up. They always want us to be at the demonstrations to bring bodies, but a lot of times they don't put us on the podium because they're nonprofits that are, basically tied to the Democratic Party. Their funders wouldn't like that. They'll tell you, well, we're putting Democrats on the podium who are elected officials. And we say, well, we got elected officials, but our elected officials may be a town councilor and they got a state legislator. And they'll say, well, you just got a town councilor, so we can't open it up for just anybody. They'll give you all kinds of excuses. But if we're in the leadership of these coalitions and really contributing, it'll be harder to keep us off the podiums at the rallies and in the media when they cover these rallies. So that's another argument for, organizing real membership locals that are active between elections. So when we get into elections, the people already know us. Oh yeah, we know those people. They're with us. They've been active on these issues. We've seen them. They're consistent. Z Manny, I think the rhetoric rate corporate sponsorship still isn't clear enough. That should a home run point that makes obvious the difference between that should be a home run point that makes obvious the difference between Greens and all the other parties. Yeah, corporate sponsorship definitely, which leads to corporate politics. So I saw one comment in the chat. I think you said something about we're getting New Deal light from the Democrats. Yeah, we're getting some phrasing, but not much substance. And I think what we can expect if it's a Harris-Walz administration is some marginal changes on domestic policy that are positive, progressive, but not much. And the main policies will still be, what the big businesses want. So, just think of one example, prescription drug costs. There are thousands of drugs. They're now regular or negotiating on 10 drugs. That becomes effective 2026. And then they got another 15. And so they're incrementally bringing down the costs on some of these drugs. And they got insulin down, which is good. But what about all those other drugs? The 2000 limit on out-of-pocket expenses is pretty significant. But, why don't we just, as the Greens advocate, make the pharmaceutical industry a public utility that operates at cost rather than cost plus profit? So that lowers costs. And its purpose is to meet people's needs for medicines, not make money off our sickness. That's a business that shouldn't be a for-profit business. So it's a pay or play or pay or die situation. I think I've told this story here before, but people die because they can't afford drugs. A guy living downstairs from me in that same place, much later than Matthew Freeman, he was an older guy that needed a drug for a kidney problem he had. And in April, he stopped buying the drugs so he could catch up on his utility bills that had gone up over the winter. And that killed him because he wasn't taking that drug. So that's why, we need the Green Party out there advocating for these things. And, the corporate sponsorship capitalism is a system that is not about meeting people's needs, certainly not, harmonizing with the environment. It's about making money for the people that own the assets. And if our needs get met, it's sort of an afterthought. It's incidental. It's not a rational way to get things done. Scout Trooper 164, do you have any updated views thus far on Ukraine taking more territory in Kursk? If all the other problems Russia's suffering doesn't sink them, I feel Ukraine digging in will. Well, I'm not prepared to say that. I think, what was I reading? It was one of the major newspapers, Wall Street Journal or New York Times report saying that the Ukrainians are not building, well fortified defense lines to protect the land that they've taken in Kursk, that oblast. They're still expanding, but slower than before because Russia now knows they're coming. And it's still not clear, what the strategy is. Is it to hold land? There's a piece of Kursk which is protected by what's called the Same River, and Ukraine has blown the bridges over that. So the Russian troops in the area that Ukraine is taking cannot resupply themselves. It's kind of what happened in Kherson province on the right bank of the Dnipro River back in the fall of 2022, and the Russians had to retreat. That's a piece of land that's got the natural defense of that wide river. It looks like they're planning to take that and hold it. So the other thing about this story I read was that, the American officials are saying, we didn't know this was going to happen, and we're still not sure what the objectives are. They're talking to the Ukrainians, which I take is, against people that say Ukraine is just a proxy for the U.S. against Russia. No, the Ukrainians got their own agency, and they're making their own decisions, and they're pushing the red lines that Biden has put around their use of weapons, which, you got to remember, Biden, in fear of an escalation that would provoke Russia to use tactical nukes, has been very slow to provide different defense or weapon systems, including air defense, Patriot missiles, missile defense, and still, won't let them use these ATACMS missiles against the air bases from which Russia is launching fighter jets or fighter jet bombers or jet fighter bombers that drop these gliding bombs, which are huge bombs, 1,000 up to 3,000 pound bombs. That I don't care what kind of defense line you've dug, it's going to wipe you out. And, the Russians are able to do that because we don't threaten the bases from which these jet fighter bombers are taking off. So there's that criticism. So, okay, this is about another question, just to finish up on Ukraine. So that's about all I can tell you. The thing that worries me, and I think a lot of people, is, are they taking forces away from the front on the east, where Russia is getting close to Provatsk? I can't remember, I'm not good at speaking Russian or Ukrainian names, but Petrovsk, that's it, which is a real hub for supplies up and down the Eastern Front. And if the Ukrainians lose that, it'll be tough. And the Russians are gaining inch by inch with lots of casualties, but they seem bent on taking that place. So I'm worried that Ukraine may be stretching their forces too thin to defend the existing front lines. So anyway, that's Ukraine. Andrew Hager, if you're aware of the existence of concrete tetrapods, do you suppose they'd be helpful to combat against rising sea levels and coastal flooding? They're good for, protecting coastline from erosion. But if the sea is rising, and flooding the coast, the concrete tetrapods will be underwater too. So I don't think they'd be too helpful dealing with rising sea levels. Zimani, do you think the NRA is funding a domestic arms race between the police and the population to help sell weapons and also to justify escalating police militarizing? I don't know if they're funding it. They are promoting it, although they're kind of in deep water right now because their former leader, was basically misusing its funds. It's divided internally. It doesn't seem to be having the same political influence it did. But yeah, because behind them are the gun sellers. They were happy to see more guns in the population, more guns with the police. That means they can sell more guns. Um, Whether they care about escalating the militarization of the police, yeah, I guess they do because that's more weapons they can sell. So I think there were some effective segments of the Democratic Party about gun violence, uh, which reinforce where the majority of Americans are. They want universal background checks. Uh, they want to get rid of the assault weapons like the AR-15 in the civilian population. And military veterans like Tim Walz were saying that at the convention. I think that's where that's a popular issue that the Democrats should keep hitting home because the Republicans are on the losing side of that one. And I think particularly among those voters that are still trying to figure out where they stand. Andrew Hager, in addition to Zimani's NRA question, would this warrant a citizen's arrest against them, or would they have the law on their side? Well, what law are they violating that you could do a citizen's arrest upon? I don't know. Fraud, because they're misleading, the consequences of what they're selling. I don't know. But if there's a law they're clearly violating and the authorities aren't doing it, the citizen's arrest would be symbolic, but it would make the point. Somebody put a link about inside secret AP3 militia, American Patriots, 3%. Maybe that's about the gun issue. Scout Trooper 164. Any views on Republicans mocking Gus Waltz on X and Facebook? Don't understand what they have against a dude with nonverbal and learning disorders and happy being for their father. Yeah, that's just mean spirited. And, the kid may, be on the spectrum, but his feelings were obviously genuine. And to, try to make fun of him, that's what bullies do. They pick on people that appear vulnerable they can get away with. So, the way to stand up to bullies is to punch them back. So, I think that's one thing that Kamala Harris is better at than Joe Biden. So I hope they will. I hope they get theirs. Yeah, that was just terrible. Zimani, RFK endorsing Trump showed he always viewed himself as some kind of appendage of the corporate duopoly. Remember his sleazy signature gathering from Gaza student protesters and refusal to debate. Yeah, the refusal to debate, the what's that group called? Free and Equal, had debates, and RFK and Cornel West refused to debate, and they got, speaking from the stage at those events, which Jill Stein did not, and she showed up to debate, people that really aren't in her league, like, the anti-abortion guy Terry, forget his last name, and I think the Libertarian, or maybe it was the Constitution Party. So, yeah, he's full of himself. He's a kid born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Had a lot of problems growing up, including heroin addiction. But he failed forward. That was another theme that Democrats pinned on Trump, which I thought was very effective. They talked about how most of us, if we make a mistake, we got to pay for it. If we go in debt, we got to, go to work to pay it off. And Trump, always had the money, and every time he screwed up, he failed upward or forward. And Kennedy's, I think, kind of the same kind of person. And read the Greg Palast thing. I don't think he's all there. So anyway, BD Dimmitt. There's a difference between strategy and tactics, Howie. Jill's campaign this cycle was the first I've heard that was blindsided by the Treasury's refusal to disperse matching funds. And there were several states where that was critical and time sensitive, including Oklahoma, where all she had to do was drop $35,000, and South Dakota, where the fledgling state party was largely the result of indigenous groups seeking redress. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. The loss of I think it's about $300,000 in matching funds that Jill is due. She needs to finish up ballot petitioning, and in Oklahoma would enable her to spend the $35,000 filing fee to get on the ballot. Although I also heard they were having trouble finding electors there, so I don't know the inside on that decision. And South Dakota, I mean, the Green Party gave them money, and they did a nice video, highlighting the indigenous in South Dakota and their affinity with the Green Party. But then when they said they had all these signatures, they didn't have any or none that they produced. So, that was unfortunate. And the campaign, with $300,000, I forget what the petitioning requirement is in South Dakota, but maybe it's $5,000. With some good paid petitioners, you can send it up there for a week and they could get it done. It was actually the Treasury Department apparently that told the FEC that don't disperse the matching funds because there's another program, the public grant for the fall election, that the major party candidates who are qualified for it could accept. It's $135 million, I think, or $120 million, somewhere in that range. But if you take that money, you can't raise private money. And of course, the Democrats and Republican presidential candidates are raising hundreds of millions, including the super PACs, billions. So they don't want that restriction if they take the public money. So it's not going to happen. So it's theoretical that there might not be enough money. The other thing that happened was they attached to the spending bill, the omnibus spending bill that funded the government for the rest of the year. I think that passed in March. They added a law in there that rated the public campaign fund and reduced it from over $400 million down to $17 million, something like that. And they put that money into election protection by local election boards and into the Secret Service to protect candidates. Those are things that need to be funded, but they shouldn't have rated the public campaign fund for that. They should tax the rich more, cut the military budget, stop fossil fuel subsidies. I mean, there are a lot of other places that money could have come from. Instead, they took it from public campaign funding. That was a bipartisan vote. When that story came out, a reporter at, I think it was Raw Story, couldn't find out who put it into the bill. So that was one of those things that happened behind closed doors and set up the situation where then Treasury could say, don't give that money to Jill Stein because we might need it for the public grant. Where in the regulations does it say the public grant is more important than the matching funds? I asked people, I know people have looked into that. I haven't got a good answer. So yeah, you're right. That was an important issue. And I should have mentioned that. That's one of the things that, Jill faced. We didn't get the matching funds we qualified for either. We qualified later. And at the time we applied, there wasn't even a quorum on the Federal Election Commission because Trump hadn't appointed people to the vacancies. So they couldn't vote us the funds anyway. It just shows, we got a lot of incompetence and subterfuge in government. Most countries have election boards and commissions, and they administer the election as a nonpartisan civil service operation. Here we have the two major parties putting their people on election boards, the Federal Election Commission. So you got the two governing parties administering their own elections. How could that, be fair? And it's hardly an issue that is contested. So Andrew Hager, ha 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 ha. I'm all right, Violet. Thanks for your concerns. Okay, that just came out of the main chat. I think our time is up for this week. We went even 10 minutes over. That's because I had a long rant this week, but I appreciate your questions and comments. And next week I'll be at Socialism 2024 and hopefully have a surprise guest. People are busy there, so I succeeded 2 years ago in getting Yulia Yurchenko, who had just come in from Ukraine, to talk about that situation. Last year, I couldn't get anybody, so I had to wing it. We'll see what happens next week, but I'll tell you what's going on at that conference. And then in 2 weeks, we'll have Butch Ware, the Green Party candidate for vice president. So everybody have a good week and, stay active. We do make a difference. We just got to be smart about how we apply our energies. And we got to get out there into the community, on the streets. It doesn't all happen online. So everybody have a good week and we'll see you next week.